and welcome to Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm Siobhan Holt, news editor at PRWeek and your host for today. I'm joined by our UK editor, John Harrington. Hi, John.
Hey, Siobhan.
Today we are joined by Mark Borkovski, PR consultant, author and popular public speaker who's often seen on television or writing column inches in the papers on all things comms, publicity and marketing. A regular in PRWeek's Power Book, Mark is the founder of his eponymous business, Borkowski, which has successfully delivered publicity, comms and crisis management campaigns for over 30 years. Thank you for joining us today, Mark. Hi.
Good afternoon and hi. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Oh no, thank you for joining us. So on today's episode, we're discussing how to navigate culture wars. There's been a spate of high-profile incidents by brands over the past year or so, from Bud Light's misstep in handling the aftermath of its partnership with trans influencer Dylan Mulvaney, to even Marks and Spencer's social media post, which was perceived by some as featuring colours resembling the Palestinian flag. And then only last month, Nike released its England's men's football kit, which featured a version of the St George's Cross on the collar. And that caused controversy because the traditional red and white colours were replaced by navy, light blue and purple. And some said it was disrespectful to alter the flag, and it became a bit of a culture war debate. As an expert then, Mark, what do you make of the controversy? Were you surprised by the attention it got?
I guess I'm never surprised by the noise that some of these issues generate. And I do use the word noise here because we've got to be very careful about how we evaluate the critique and the noise is cancelled. And you did bring up the Dylan Mulvaney Bud Light commercial, and that had a profound effect. I mean, we saw Bud Light's prominence in US beer market fall 25%. It fell off the cliff and it became the butt of every meme going. That's more than noise. That is having a profound effect on the sort of lifeblood of the brand, and various people fell by the wayside, including some of the key people in Bud who'd made the decision to use Mulvaney. So I think that language is very important at the moment, and what I mean by that is one has to evaluate very carefully about what's going on, because a lot of people kick off, a lot of people, use platforms and generate a lot of noise, because we're in the world of influencers, we're in the world of clickbait, where clickbait, is valuable, and particularly if you're establishing a persona or you have a valued sort of platform that generates, a certain amount of income. So people dive into the negative, and we're seeing that surrounded. But profound effects on the brand for making poor decisions, that isn't something that actually can turn heads overnight. It is the beginning of a journey, and you quoted there, the decision that Bud made and arguably made the situation worse. So one always has to evaluate the question why, and something a lot more old-fashioned. It is something which is KYC. Know your customer. Do you understand hubristically, if you're in a comm zone where you're listening to social media agencies, looking at ad agencies, PR agencies or whatever, everybody wants to show a different point of view or even look at building a new type of audience. But choosing the wrong methodology to achieve that is where things start to unpick the heritage and sometimes the brand strength.
Yeah, I mean, what would have been your advice in this situation, would you say, if you were Nike or advising Nike?
I think that you always have to sort of be at the start of the discussions. You need to be in the room when something of this magnitude is being chosen. Some of the great brands sort of, pull all elements of comms and marketing into room to have an open discussion and a strategic point of view of what they're doing. And I think that that's the point where one has to build from. If you're not in the room and you're inheriting a problem, it's difficult because the die has been cast, the mold has been set. So to a certain extent, the question is, you have to ask the very difficult questions about why you're doing this. And you do have to have a certain strength in your convictions to actually challenge the client, because, you might be running against your fee by battling for something that maybe is not in tune with the rest of the room. And we can all get really obsessed by ideas. Ideas are great. Creativity can go great. New directions can be wonderful. But sometimes they're not thought through and the consequences are not seen. The wisdom of PR folk is something that is really something I'm always in awe of, is that you have sensible PR heads in a room will find an elegant way of impressing people on the conditions that they face. And I've been in rooms with people who have actually not seen it, and on the opposite, have seen it. And it's changed the direction of where the marketing is going. So it's important to be in that room, to work as a collaborative team, to look at challenging and really aggressive ideas that run against what the brand has done. So I think that, sometimes there's a very sensible way of navigating the brand away from this by using very clever language. I think the wrong tone, the wrong words chosen can inflame the situation. So the wisdom of actually keeping the message simple and sometimes unwinding very quickly when you can actually see this is going the wrong way and moving out of that, being authentic, being honest, that if mistakes are made, make those mistakes, but sometimes not jumping too quickly and not pandering to the sort of influencers that want to create trouble, that need this to be negative because they feed off that negativity. The long answer to a very short question is to be in a pole position, either to guide people out of it very quickly, accepting mistakes and moving on with something that is fresher and new and more sensible, rather than prolonging the situation, creating a huge vacuum sometimes that is filled with a lot more, how should you say, inopportune commentary that actually causes the brand more issues.
And would you say at the moment that you think maybe that is slightly the issue, that some people do prolong it rather than moving on or finding something they can move on with?
The short answer to a question, yes, I think that it does help certain people to create more mischief. It is easy to be negative than it is to be positive. Always has been. That will never change. And it's easy to be pushing against a brand by calling them, the bad actor in this case. I notice with crises and situations like things move on very quickly. There is always somebody out there who's making a mistake, which takes the sort of line of fire away from you. These things don't sustain as long as you've done the correct things. And getting involved with culture war issues is sometimes the most difficult things to unwind with, particularly when you're talking about trans issues, you're talking about sexual politics, you're talking about if those sort of things. You need to counsel organizations to really challenge them to make sure they're doing the right thing. But things don't sustain as long as the heart of what you're trying to do is the right thing. I think audiences will stick by you. But if you try and sort of wriggle way out of it, throw someone in under the bus, a junior heads can roll, people see through that. So you're adding more ammunition to it. And we're seeing a lot of sort of fringe broadcasters, we're looking, influencers, TikTokers, and whatever, who need this sort of debate for their own prominence, their own ability to leverage their platform.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I wrote a piece quite recently about the Nike situation where I was kind of suggesting that, there's this real sense that some brands maybe try to court controversy sometimes, and they actively want to be part of this, and maybe they want to be seen on the right side of the culture war debate, but whether that's a good idea or not. But as part of that, I looked at this idea that, sort of the way the media is now, there are sort of fewer journalists and there's more and more pressure to get more clicks and more exposure to these articles. So actually, culture war stuff is good for clicks. Rage clicks do well. To what extent, I guess, do you think that is having an impact on this trend of sort of brands falling foul of culture war type debates?
It's a huge issue because, brands always want to be relevant to a younger audience. That marketplace between, let's say, 18 to 35, if we're looking at a demographic, is a lifeblood. And you don't, particularly in fashion, particularly in apparel, you don't want to be seen as some old fuddy-duddy brand that, people will disengage with, to some bright young thing that's coming onto the market that seems to be, highly connected with the right influencers. So you're forever living in this sort of hamster wheel of actually remaining relevant. And of course, relevancy now is a whole younger generation who have a completely different set of values. Sometimes than the very custodians of that brand. And the danger usually comes when it feels a bit like dad dancing at a wedding. It is absolutely the wrong thing to do, but somehow there's a sort of necessity to try and do it to remain relevant, because the fear is there's some hotshot brand hot on the heels are going to sort of steal your breakfast, lunch and supper. So it needs a huge amount of confidence. And also, you've got the sort of importance of awards. And actually, if you're a communications agency, if you've done something that's smart and modern and different, you're going to win an award. If you win an award, that's going to be remarkable for your upturn in your business. And sometimes people going for awards, particularly the advertising community, are not as switched on to sort of cultural trends and issues that PR folk are. I think PR folk have got better brains in terms of understanding the zeitgeist, where you come up with a great idea, throw it into the mix, and next time you're facing a huge controversy. And very, very few brands can live with controversy. It's really hip to be a maverick, to be controversial, and we've seen great examples of outliers. Things like Brewdog who've done some remarkable stuff. Paddy Power, who broke the mold in some of the communication exercises, and other people look to that. But have you got the structure? Have you got the skill set in place to behave like that? I mean, stretching back to my early days, where we did a lot of sort of alcohol work, and not particularly that proud of it really now. We did a lot of work in the alcopops market. Arguably, we were a leading player in that space. And I remember, I won't mention the brand that came to us and said, we want to be more radical, we want to be more Malcolm McLaren, we want to do things to get us banned. And of course, we fulfilled that brief. And we played with the Portman Group. We played with sort of messaging and stunts that were on the edge, that played around with many of the legislation and the sort of responsible drinking message that was coming in. And sure enough, it affected the share price of the group, fired up, and the 3 or 4 people involved in that campaign all got fired. But I fulfilled the brief. I gave them what they wanted to. They wanted to get the thing banned. So I think that what people wish for sometimes is not really what they want. They want to be a little bit edgy, but they want to be able to go home every night safe in the fact that they're going to get their bonus and they can pay their kids' school fees.
It's interesting, isn't it? And talking about drinks brands, and I was, while we're having this conversation, I was thinking about a few years ago, Brewdog. Remember they came out with this pink IPA, a take on punk IPA for International Women's Day, and then they had to write like hashtag sarcasm when they were promoting it and stuff. But obviously they weren't actually producing it as a proper serious thing. And I think that was pretty terrible. It strikes me that maybe the era of the sort of Brewdog out there kind of millennial disruptor type brands is perhaps a little bit behind us now, because CEOs are so much more risk averse. And obviously Brewdog have had their own problems more recently, which is maybe slightly connected to that, but obviously there are other issues going on there.
Actually, John, I think brands can become too famous. I think you have a shooting star of popularity. You're on the sort of lips of everybody talking about how radical, how interesting you were. To keep that up is incredibly difficult, and that's where you can never quite better some of your original stunts, and that's why people have to develop their personality and their comms. And it isn't just slavishly following down clever stunt after clever stunt, but sooner or later the audience absolutely get bored with it. And if you have any other issues locked away in your provenance of your business, then obviously those things will come to hurt you. So I think that everything sort of matures from a position where you can do big, bad and dangerous things. But language, I mean, going back to it, the use of language and carefully worded sort of statements that can be seized upon and twisted and nuanced is perhaps one of the most dangerous sort of things. I do believe that people, they do feel to be becoming less risk averse, simply because, and I think the Dylan Mulvaney Bud Light thing is a classic high watermark in that, where you can actually see how the whole thing unpicks. We've seen lots of sort of fashion brands do some dangerous stuff. Balenciaga did something fairly recently that generated a lot of noise. But some of those brands can reshape and remorph because they've got the ability to be able to move on, and actually sometimes the budget and the teams behind them to come up with something even better. It can hit the very psyche of the internal organization, that once you've been beaten up by social media, once you've been trolled, and you're a chief executive and you find people protesting outside of your home, which has happened, you begin to think twice about some of the more risky stuff that you choose to do, because it's a fragmented world. It's splinternet of different channels that you've got to get across, and really small niches can sort of build momentum and negativity against you. And so therefore having a holistic sort of strategy that sort of binds the advertising, marketing, social media, PR, corporate comms, together is a really big thing to do. And people being knitted together and not trying to buy time, and provenance over one department over the other. Well, we hold the budget and we hold, the power here. It's got to be a very collaborative organisation, and I think that's where you see things going. But if you look back to the history of people who've used sort of edgy campaigns, Benetton being a classic example in the 90s, somehow it turns against them sooner or later, because the ubiquity, is something that becomes to haunt them.
We'll join you again shortly after this quick break. We're talking there a lot about stunt campaigns and things like that. I was just wondering what your advice would be for then sort of organisations that are maybe like the National Trust, that have faced their own challenges with historical monuments and artefacts and their associations with the slave trade, and how they move away from that. And also ULEZ as well, they've also faced real criticism. And I was just wondering what your advice would be for those, because they're not really caught in it in the same way that maybe a fashion brand is or a beer brand is.
I mean, some of the issues of culture war are not just around sort of gender. I mean, you hit the nail on the head of some of the issues that have come out of our empire past. And I think that there's some very difficult conversations to be had with some of those organisations that are holding artefacts and art that arguably should be repatriated, because of questionably how they arrived in this country. And I think that we've seen it, the conversation post BLM that continues now. We're always seeing some of the right-wing media talking about, how various brands are represented, on advertising at the moment in terms of, culture. And there feels like there's a generation coming through that are much more at ease with these issues, much more relaxed about it. But that doesn't sort out the immediacy of the problem. And I think that there are a number of organisations doing profound communication audits on how they should behave. I mean, we're seeing some of the climate protests at the moment and dragging brands into a greater responsibility in terms of their global footprint, how they organise. It seems that every aspect of the way a brand, a company, an organisation goes forward is very difficult. Every organisation has its own challenges, and therefore when you have your own challenges, you then have to be very focused and self-centered on what your answers are to those sort of challenges, and how you address them. And some people tend to look at some of the first sort of negative messages coming forward and try and bury their head. But I noticed that there was a massive TikTok trend about artifacts. You brought up the artifacts, and I noticed that one or two of the organisations who faced that did a very good job by communicating and accepting that there were issues, and they intended to do something about it, but pleaded with those sort of younger TikTokers for them to have time to address how best to meet the demands of a growing younger audience who felt that many of these artifacts should not reside in these mausoleums in this country. And I think that comes back to my original point about honesty and forthrightness and meeting and having a conversation or creating a dialogue with people in an attempt to come up with sensible and profound solutions to very complex matters. And I think that if you have a personality that expresses that, I think there's greater empathy rather than people who put their hard hat on, bury themselves way below the parapet and hope that these things disappear. And I think those sort of people are trying to address it, as opposed to, it's in the too difficult box. We'll hand it over to someone who's going to deal with this in 5 or 6 years' time. Those sort of brands tend to be found out.
It's interesting, isn't it? I don't know. Did you see the controversy with Joe Wicks in the last couple of days, by the way? He was interviewed on a podcast, I think, and he was making a link between ADHD and diet. And this led to a really strong backlash. And there are a couple of stories about it in the tabloids. And he came out with an apology, and some people said the apology didn't quite go far enough. And he said, it was taken out of context, that kind of argument. But also he said, I do think there's a link between behaviour and diet. But for some people, it felt like it didn't really quite go far enough, and it wasn't a fulsome enough apology. But then at the same time, Wicks probably does still think there is a link between certainly behaviour and diet. But I can also see he's not an expert on ADHD. He's a personal trainer by background. But I just wondered if you'd seen that one.
I just think that do you know what? In this day and age, you've got to have a Teflon skin. You've got to be able to take it. It's like going into battle with a fear of blood. It's hard and it's tough. And if you're going to choose that, you've got to get real with it, and you've got to have, proper research and proper people behind you doing it. And also, I say to people, don't get involved in an argument. Don't get involved in striking points if it's an opinion not based on facts. Don't play with emotion. And usually the people, ironically, sometimes with the soft underbelly, do get too emotional about these things and do have to actually prove to be right. I think we go back against that fragmentation, that the traditional media is waning in many ways, and therefore, people want to hear people speak. So therefore, the ability to talk into a camera and actually people see in the whites of their eyes just what they're saying, unfortunately, that's got to be backed up with some sense of realism that you're not going to get it right. You've got to somehow change the percentages around these sort of things. If you've got 90% people against you, you've got to try and do something about that. If you've got 70% or 75% people with you, you're never going to convince that missing 25% quadrant. And there's no point trying to deal with it. And you just hope within that quadrant there aren't some sort of vociferous people with some very big followings, because we're in an age of really ridiculous conspiracy theories, and we're dealing with massive world events at the moment that really eclipse some of the sort of battles we've been talking about in the culture wars. Some really, profound social and economic factors here that brands have to somehow have a corporate position on. And that's incredibly difficult, particularly if you have a footprint across the world, whether or not you're involved sort of locally in one of the hotspots or whatever. It never before has there been more complications, more elephant traps to fall into than ever before in my career.
Do you think then that we're obviously talking there about an example where someone apologised pretty much straight away, and I was just wondering whether you think that is, most of the brands we've discussed actually pretty much apologise straight away. I was just wondering if there are circumstances maybe where they should stay silent.
Listen, I think there are occasions where there might be a situation where you have to stay silent. There might be a legal perspective for it, that you're not allowed to not do anything because there might be legal issues you face. But I think you can close down the problems by meeting it. The worst thing to do is to create a vacuum, is to allow a vacuum to form that other people are filling it, sometimes with erroneous facts and rather stupid idiocy that then catches fire and people jump up across it as it's a fact. But I think that people can be really forgiving if there's some downright, real, authentic honesty involved at the point of where you're going. Now that for a big organisation, who's having to sort of keep the stock price and shareholders happy, that is difficult. Where you see some issues created by the culture wars being sort of manhandled by a legal guys, counsel involved. You feel that there's a legal response, and I think people can smell it. They can actually smell when there's something not right there. So you've got to really sense check and actually argue, the case. And that's why I think PR over the next, 10 or 20 years, particularly in the corporate space and whatever, is going to really flourish, because there are some fantastic operators, in this country, around the world, in Europe, actually, offering some fantastic advice, proffering, some solid recommendations. And if I was in a situation, I'd be listening to the counsel of my PR people, not the sort of crazy creativity of an ad agency or a social media company or a media house giving us their 5 pence of what they should be doing. Let's advertise out of it. I think, that's where the real power for PR exists, in my estimation. Look, the one thing is now that I think there's a greater need for whoever's at the top of an organisation to actually be a remarkable communicator. Usually, if you've risen to the heights of one of the big companies in the world, you get there not because purely of your communication skills. You're a great leader. You understand the business. You've achieved things within that business. And the necessity to be a great communicator sometimes doesn't sit on the shoulders of those sort of people. And so therefore, they're not great. I mean, we're seeing, post the Richard Branson sort of personality cult that led Virgin from, record industry titan to become, one of the biggest brands in the world. That's not an exaggeration. He was a unique beast to a certain extent. And I think that we certainly expect those leaders to face up to criticism. But I go back to the issue sometimes that whatever you're saying, one word can wipe millions off share price, can bring it back from the dead, can see your. I mean, Tony Hayward at the height of the BP crisis, which I think the burning rig out in Mexico. I mean, the guy just couldn't communicate. He was making things worse. There was no sense of strength coming from him. So I think what we'll see in the next 20 or 30 years, much better leaders who are highly tuned to the needs of communicating with the medium which will be prominent in that age.
Yeah, makes total sense. Does make total sense.
That's it for this week's podcast. Thank you very much to Mark for today. That was a really informative chat and one I think our listeners are going to really value. Before we go, I'd quickly like to plug the PRWeek UK Awards, our biggest awards event of the year, so get your entries in today. And do check out prweek.com for all the latest news and all our great events too that are coming up in 2024. And if you've enjoyed today's episode, then we'd love it if you could leave a review, please, wherever you access PRWeek's Beyond the Noise podcast. This podcast goes live every 2 weeks, but look out for our shorter news-based Noise in Brief, which comes out next week. That's all for today. Thank you for listening. See you next time.